The winter night of December 24th, 1944, settled over Budapest like a suffocating veil, its quiet pierced only by the distant rumble of Soviet artillery crawling closer through the darkness. Snow clung to the rooftops, but the Danube shimmered faintly with the reflection of fires burning on the outskirts of the city, fires lit by retreating German units desperate to slow the advancing Red Army. In the ancient castle district, Hungarian soldiers, cold, exhausted, and outnumbered, pressed their backs against shattered stone walls as they scanned the frozen riverbanks for movement. Civilians huddled in basements beneath trembling chandeliers, clutching blankets and rosaries, listening to each explosion as if it were a countdown to something irreversible. That same night, Colonel Károly recorded in his field diary, "If Budapest falls, the heart of our nation falls with it." And when the first Soviet searchlights finally swept across the Buda Hills in long, blinding arcs, there was no mistaking what was coming. Budapest was no longer a city preparing for siege. It had already become the battlefield that would extinguish Hungary's last hope of changing the course of the war. By late 1944, Hungary found itself pulled into the darkest gravity of a war it no longer had the strength or political coherence to navigate. Once a reluctant Axis ally seeking territorial restoration after the Treaty of Trianon, Hungary had gradually become trapped between Nazi demands and Soviet retribution, its strategic autonomy shrinking with each passing month. After Germany's occupation in March 1944 and the failed attempt by Regent Miklos Horthy to negotiate an armistice, the country fell under the control of the Arrow Cross regime, an extremist government that clung desperately to Berlin even as the war's outcome was becoming unmistakable. Under German oversight, Budapest transformed from an elegant, culturally vibrant capital into a militarized stronghold with trenches carved into boulevards, machine gun nests established behind ornate facades, and bridges fortified with explosives. German commanders viewed the city as a critical defensive anchor on the Eastern Front, while for Hungarian officers struggling to maintain the loyalty of their troops, Budapest represented something deeper, the last symbolic barrier against national collapse. Meanwhile, the Red Army's rapid advance across Eastern Europe sent waves of fear through the civilian population. Refugees from Transylvania and the Carpathians arrived with stories of burned villages, executions, and retribution for years of Hungarian participation in Axis campaigns. These accounts circulated through the city, amplifying anxieties already sharpened by food shortages, air raid warnings, and the knowledge that Soviet forces now stood less than 100 kilometers from the capital. The broader military context only deepened the crisis. By October 1944, the Soviet 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts had pushed into the Great Hungarian Plain, overwhelming defensive lines that had been hastily constructed and undermanned. German attempts to reinforce the region with armored divisions failed to slow the Soviet advance, in part due to fuel shortages and the Luftwaffe's near-total loss of air superiority. As the Red Army closed in on Budapest, the Wehrmacht ordered the city to be transformed into a fortified zone, designating it a Festung, a fortress to be defended at all costs. This decision doomed the civilian population to endure one of the most brutal sieges of the European war.
They fought because the enemy
German and Hungarian engineers mined key bridges across the Danube and converted schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks into firing positions. The city's geography further amplified the looming battle. The Danube, splitting Buda and Pest, created natural barriers but also confined defenders into increasingly isolated sectors once the assault began. Soviet planners recognized these vulnerabilities. Their objective was not simply to capture a capital, but to fracture Axis resistance in Central Europe by cutting off Germany's southern supply lines and forcing a collapse of the Hungarian front. Within Budapest, daily life had deteriorated into a grim routine of scarcity and fear. Food distribution collapsed as railway lines were severed, leaving residents dependent on dwindling reserves and irregular rations. Fuel shortages forced families to burn furniture and floorboards to survive winter nights. Hospitals, overwhelmed by wounded soldiers and civilians, struggled with limited medicine and failing electricity. The once cosmopolitan city, famous for its cafes, theaters, and thermal baths, felt increasingly like a labyrinth of ruins waiting for the front to arrive. The Jewish population, already subjected to severe persecution under German occupation and Arrow Cross rule, faced escalating terror as Arrow Cross militias carried out mass executions along the banks of the Danube, murdering thousands in the final weeks before the siege. These atrocities left psychological scars that deepened the city's sense of impending doom. Even among the defenders, morale was fragile. Many Hungarian soldiers were conscripts with little enthusiasm for fighting on behalf of a collapsing regime, while German units, though more disciplined, were stretched thin, exhausted by months of retreat from the Carpathians. Yet both forces understood the strategic value of the city and the symbolic weight attached to its survival. Orders were clear: Budapest would not be surrendered. Meanwhile, Soviet forces approached with momentum forged from victories across Eastern Europe. Under the command of Marshal Rodion Malinovsky and Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin, the Red Army brought with it a formidable array of artillery, tanks, and infantry divisions seasoned by years of brutal combat from Stalingrad to the Carpathians. Their logistical lines, though strained by winter conditions, remained intact enough to sustain a prolonged urban battle, and their strategic directives emphasized both the seizure of Budapest and the encirclement of German forces in western Hungary. Reconnaissance units surveyed the outskirts of the city, noting the defensive positions constructed along key avenues and river crossings. Soviet officers understood that Budapest's dense urban terrain would slow their advance and cost significant casualties, but they also recognized the city's political and military importance. Capturing it would open the path to Vienna and ensure Soviet influence over post-war Central Europe. As December approached, preparations intensified. Artillery batteries positioned themselves on hills overlooking the city, tank brigades maneuvered into staging grounds, and infantry units readied for the brutal task of urban clearing. All these elements, strategic desperation, political instability, logistical collapse, and the relentless pressure of the Red Army, converged like fault lines beneath Budapest, priming the city for a siege that would tear at the fabric of its society. And as the encirclement tightened and the final avenues of retreat began to close, the deeper internal tensions and political fractures that shaped Hungary's fate would soon surface, setting the stage for a more intricate analysis in the next section. As the final weeks of 1944 unfolded, the political and military turmoil inside Hungary deepened into a crisis that left the nation effectively unable to steer its own fate. After the Germans arrested Regent Miklos Horthy and installed Ferenc Selassie and the Arrow Cross regime, Budapest became a city ruled by chaos disguised as authority. Selassie, driven by ideological fervor rather than strategic reality, issued proclamations of total resistance while German commanders quietly reassessed how much of the Hungarian capital they could realistically hold. Arrow Cross officials, lacking the discipline and planning expertise of the Wehrmacht, devoted more effort to suppressing political opponents and terrorizing civilians than strengthening the city's defenses. Their brutality, particularly against Jews forced into makeshift ghettos along the Danube, further eroded public morale and diverted manpower from the looming siege. Communications between military units and government officials grew strained. Reports of Soviet advances were met with mixtures of disbelief and denial, and rumors of an imminent encirclement spread through Budapest's neighborhoods like a cold draft slipping through cracked windows. Even among the elite German staff officers operating inside the castle district, the sense of impending crisis darkened the tone of their daily briefings. Some pressed for an organized withdrawal westward, others insisted that Hitler's orders to hold Budapest at all costs left no room for strategic maneuver. Ultimately, political ideology overruled military logic, sealing the city's fate. Logistically, the city's collapse was already far advanced before the first Soviet shells landed. Fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, leaving tanks and armored vehicles parked behind barricades more as static symbols of defiance than functional weapons of war. Ammunition stocks dwindled rapidly as retreating German units consumed supplies meant for the city's defense. Food distribution networks unraveled completely once Soviet forces cut the last rail lines leading into the capital. Winter cold tightened its grip, turning every night into a test of endurance for soldiers and civilians alike. The Danube's icy currents carried debris downstream, pieces of destroyed bridges, broken carts, even the bodies of those caught in Aerocross raids or collateral fire during Soviet artillery probing. The physical landscape of Budapest began to mirror the psychological fragmentation occurring within its population. Breadlines formed before dawn. Families crowded into overcrowded cellars. Entire districts echoed with the sound of hammers as defenders boarded windows, fortified courtyards, and converted basements into defensive positions. The city that had once been celebrated for its architecture and cultural refinement had transformed into a labyrinth of barricades, trenches, and improvised strongpoints. Inside the German command structure, tension sharpened as officers attempted to reconcile the growing contradiction between Hitler's directives and their own assessments of the battlefield. Field Marshal Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruch, appointed to command the HQ SS Mountain Corps within Budapest, struggled to impose cohesion among disparate units of German and Hungarian forces. Many Hungarian soldiers had little desire to die for Hitler or Selassie, and desertions increased as the situation worsened. German troops, though better trained, were exhausted from months of retreat and viewed Budapest as a temporary resting point rather than a fortress. Their confidence in their ability to hold the city was thin, and their ability to retreat was evaporating. Yet with Hitler demanding that Budapest be defended like Stalingrad, the possibility of an orderly withdrawal had effectively vanished. Every directive from Berlin reinforced a single, uncompromising message: Budapest must not fall. The command staff understood the implications well. Such orders meant that every building, every street, every bridge would eventually become a battlefield. On the Soviet side, strategic calculations were influenced not only by military necessity, but also by long-term geopolitical considerations. Capturing Budapest would demonstrate Soviet strength to both the Allies and the remnants of Axis Europe, while securing a foothold for an advance toward Vienna. Stalin's expectations were clear. The city must be taken swiftly and decisively. Soviet commanders planned their assault accordingly, assembling massive artillery concentrations on the surrounding hills and coordinating infantry divisions for simultaneous thrusts toward key bridges, rail yards, and communication hubs. The Red Army's approach was methodical. They aimed not only to capture the city, but to encircle and destroy the German-Hungarian forces inside it. Intelligence reports indicated that Budapest's defenders were disorganized and undersupplied, encouraging Soviet planners to execute a full encirclement, a tactical decision that would transform the battle from an attempted breakthrough into a desperate fight for survival. As December turned to January, Budapest became a city suspended between collapsing internal order and an external siege tightening like a vice. Within days of the encirclement, defenders realized that the battle ahead would not resemble previous retreats or tactical withdrawals. Escape routes had closed, supply lines had disintegrated, and reinforcements were too far away to alter the city's trajectory. What remained was a mix of desperation, defiance, and resignation. German and Hungarian soldiers dug deeper into ruined buildings, preparing for house-to-house fighting that both sides knew would extract a brutal toll. Civilians braced for starvation and bombardment, clinging to fragments of hope that the siege might be lifted before the city was destroyed entirely. All the tensions, political fractures, logistical failures, conflicting commands, and the overwhelming momentum of the Soviet advance now converged with lethal clarity, setting the stage for the human perspectives and emotional experiences that would define the opening phase of the siege. For the Hungarian infantrymen stationed along the front lines inside Pest, the siege did not begin with a dramatic explosion or a trumpet of war. It began with silence, the kind that settles before a storm. Most were young conscripts drawn from villages that had never imagined their sons would fight street by street in their own capital. They crouched behind overturned trams and hastily built barricades, gripping rifles made unreliable by the winter cold.
It's okay, baby.
Private Laszlo Toth later wrote in a surviving fragment of his diary that the worst part was hearing the city breathe in fear. He and his comrades knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by a political system that demanded sacrifice without offering hope. When Soviet artillery began probing the outskirts of Pest with sporadic shells, the Hungarian soldiers reacted not with defiance, but with a tense, resigned determination. They fought because the enemy was close, because retreat was impossible, and because the streets beneath their feet were familiar. That familiarity gave them a sense of duty, even as despair whispered that Budapest was already lost. Their fear did not stem from cowardice, but from the dawning realization that survival and victory had parted ways long before the first Soviet infantry crossed into the city. German commanders overseeing the defense offered a starkly different perspective, shaped by military training, ideological pressure, and the grim knowledge that Hitler viewed Budapest not as a city, but as a symbol. Many officers had served on multiple fronts and carried memories of defeats from Stalingrad to Warsaw. They recognized instantly that the defensive layout of Budapest, though impressive on maps, lacked the manpower, ammunition, and armored support needed to withstand a determined Soviet assault. Yet official directives permitted no flexibility. Orders to hold every street and every bridge were absolute, and failure carried severe consequences. Among these commanders was SS General Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch, whose staff attempted to impose structure over a chaotic mix of exhausted German units and reluctant Hungarian conscripts. His perspective was one of tightening constraints. Every decision made under the weight of dwindling resources and the constant demands of Berlin. Report diaries note his frustration with contradictory orders. Hold Budapest as a fortress, but conduct counterattacks without fuel. Defend bridges, but be prepared to demolish them at a moment's notice. His worldview hardened into a single grim expectation. The city would be held until it died. For the civilians of Budapest, the siege became an unending nightmare that unfolded with terrifying unpredictability. Families crowded into damp basements beneath grand apartment buildings that once echoed with laughter and music. Now these shelters reeked of smoke, sweat, and fear. Women carried water from frozen street pumps while dodging sniper fire. Children scavenged splinters of wood for warmth. The elderly huddled beneath blankets as artillery shells shook dust from collapsing ceilings. Many civilians had welcomed neither the Germans nor the Soviets, but found themselves trapped between two armies that saw the city as a strategic prize rather than a living home. Their perspective was deeply human, a blend of terror, confusion, and an instinct for survival. One mother later recounted that the greatest horror was not hunger or cold, but not knowing where my children were when the bombs fell. Each day brought new losses, neighbors buried by rubble, homes consumed by fire, and entire streets transformed into battlegrounds strewn with shattered glass and frozen corpses. For civilians, the war was not defined by ideology, but by the struggle to find bread and to keep loved ones alive for one more night. Soviet soldiers approaching Budapest carried their own heavy perspective, one shaped by years of brutal fighting from Stalingrad through Ukraine. Many viewed the assault on Budapest as both a duty and a personal reckoning. They had lost comrades in earlier campaigns and now advanced with a mix of hardened resolve and weary fatalism. Soviet commanders reminded their troops of the political importance of capturing the city, emphasizing that Budapest was a gateway to Vienna and a symbol of Axis resistance in Central Europe. Infantrymen moving through the outskirts encountered scenes of destruction that reflected their own past suffering. Burned homes, abandoned wagons, frozen corpses lying in the snow. This familiarity did not dull the violence, it sharpened it. For many Red Army soldiers, Budapest was another chapter in a long, exhausting march westward, and they fought with the relentless endurance of men who had known hardship far longer than their opponents. Their diaries speak of bitter cold, the difficulty of navigating urban streets under fire, and the haunting sensation of advancing through a city that resisted not with confidence, but with desperation. Together, these perspectives, Hungarian conscripts, German commanders, civilians, and Soviet infantry, formed a complex emotional and strategic mosaic that defined the opening phase of the siege, paving the way for deeper fractures and escalating tension explored in the next section. Inside the upper tiers of Hungary's political and military leadership, the siege forced a reckoning that many had long postponed. Ferenc Szalasi's Arrow Cross regime, installed by German intervention and intoxicated by ideological zeal, clung to the notion that Budapest must be defended as a sacred national duty, regardless of the cost. Yet within the ranks of senior Hungarian officers, a different sentiment simmered quietly. Many recognized that the city's defense had
must
ceased to be a
achieve a
strategic
breakthrough
operation
immediately.
and
The
had
city
instead
must
become a
fall.
symbolic gesture
Reports
forced upon
confirm
them
the
by
shortages,
Berlin.
comrade.
General
But
Ivan
our
Hindi,
units are
responsible
suffering
for
in this
coordinating
grind.
Hungarian units within the encircled capital, noted privately that his troops lacked ammunition, training, and the will to fight a battle whose outcome was predetermined. His perspective was one of bitter resignation.
these
He understood the
elements,
historic weight of
strategic
defending Budapest,
desperation,
yet he also saw the
political
futility of
instability,
sacrificing an
logistical
entire
collapse,
generation of Hungarian
and the
soldiers for a regime losing control of the nation. Conversations among Hungarian officers often revolved around the same grim theme. They were fighting a war not for their country's survival, but for Germany's refusal to accept defeat. Their sense of duty collided with a growing realization that every decision they made, every order, every attempt to hold a district, every counterattack, was merely delaying an inevitable tragedy. From the perspective of frontline tacticians, the siege offered endless challenges that revealed the widening gap between command directives and battlefield reality. German and Hungarian unit leaders faced constant shortages that forced them to improvise with dwindling resources. Ammunition trucks failed to arrive, radios malfunctioned in the freeze, medical stations overflowed with casualties, forcing medics to work by candlelight in basements thick with smoke. Officers attempting to coordinate defenses often found that their units had been reduced to scattered clusters of exhausted men holding ruined stairwells or snow-covered courtyards. Reports sent to Corps headquarters described the same pattern again and again. Lines collapsing under artillery fire, counterattacks petering out due to lack of fuel or ammunition, and neighborhoods changing hands multiple times within a single day. For these tacticians, the siege became an exercise in survival rather than strategy. They viewed the unfolding battle not through ideological conviction or grand strategic vision, but through the immediate visceral struggle to keep their men alive for a few hours longer. Beyond the front lines, the civilian experience evolved into a harrowing struggle that blurred the boundaries between survival trauma and endurance. As the siege intensified, entire districts lost access to electricity and clean water. People boiled snow to drink. Churches, schools, and apartment blocks served as makeshift morgues, their hallways lined with bodies wrapped in sheets or rugs. Families slept in stairwells and storage rooms to escape collapsing ceilings during bombardments. The sound of artillery became a constant backdrop. A thunder that rolled through the city day and night, shaking windows and nerves with equal force. Civilians observed the conflict from the perspective of those who had no choice in the matter. Their suffering was not strategic. It was immediate and personal. They endured hunger that gnawed at their strength and fear that distorted time into a series of endless nights. Diaries from the siege capture moments of heartbreaking clarity. A father tearing apart a floorboard to fuel a dying fire. A young girl pressing her hands against her ears as shells detonated nearby. A grandmother whispering prayers for a city she no longer recognized. For these civilians, Budapest was both home and prison, a place where every street corner whispered danger and every day presented a new test of resilience. In contrast, the Soviet High Command viewed the siege through a lens shaped by long-term objectives and geopolitical ambitions. Marshal Tolbukin and Marshal Malinovsky understood that capturing Budapest was essential not only for military progress, but also for securing post-war influence in Central Europe. Their perspective merged operational precision with political symbolism. They pressed their commanders to achieve breakthroughs quickly, even as the fighting inside the city grew more brutal. Soviet intelligence reports documented the extent of Axis shortages and predicted that morale among Hungarian defenders would erode as the siege dragged on. Yet Soviet units themselves suffered under the harsh winter conditions and the deadly grind of urban combat. The soldiers advancing through narrow streets and ruined buildings saw the city not as a strategic prize, but as another hostile maze filled with ambushes, snipers, and mines. Still, their determination was fueled by the belief that they were approaching a decisive moment in a long war of survival and revenge. For many Soviet soldiers, Budapest represented an obstacle that had to be broken through, regardless of the cost. Amid all these perspectives, a unifying tension began to emerge, a sense that the siege was moving toward a decisive turning point. German commanders debated breakout attempts. Hungarian officers questioned whether continuing the fight held any meaning. Civilians whispered rumors of Soviet advances inching closer to the Danube. Soviet commanders prepared fresh assaults intended to fracture what remained of the city's defenses. Every perspective, whether shaped by ideology, duty, survival, or vengeance, sensed that the battle was approaching a moment when the fate of Budapest would be irrevocably sealed. And that moment would arrive with the ferocity of a storm in the next phase of the conflict. By the second week of January 1945, Budapest had become a city locked in a death struggle, its streets transformed into a labyrinth of shattered stone, frozen corpses, and choking smoke. The Danube, once a symbol of the city's elegance, now served as a deadly fault line dividing German and Hungarian forces clinging to their shrinking foothold in Buda from the relentless Soviet assault pouring through Pest. The great bridges, Margit, Chain, reshaped, once threads binding the city's two halves, were now reduced to twisted ruins, their destruction ordered in desperation to slow the Soviet advance. Yet even these explosions failed to halt the tide. Soviet artillery batteries, positioned on the hills surrounding the capital, rained shells onto Pest with a fury that left entire districts unrecognizable. Buildings collapsed inward like dying giants, sending clouds of dust that blended with the winter fog, while flames climbed through the skeletons of homes and churches. Every street became a choke point, every intersection a killing ground. Soviet infantry advanced behind the thunder of Katyusha rocket barrages, moving cautiously through doorways blasted open by tank rounds, clearing rooms with grenades and bayonets. Their progress was slow, brutal, and methodical, exacting immense casualties on both sides. Inside the encircled city, German and Hungarian defenders attempted to orchestrate counterattacks, but their efforts were increasingly haphazard and doomed. Units that had once been battalions were now reduced to platoons or handfuls of exhausted survivors, their uniforms stiff with frost and grime. Reports from officers described ammunition stocks so low that soldiers rationed each bullet, sometimes saving their last rounds for themselves rather than risk capture. Food supplies had reached critical levels. Many defenders survived on handfuls of grain, scraps of frozen vegetables, or whatever they could scavenge from abandoned apartments. Horses, once used for transport, were slaughtered for meat. Yet despite these conditions, some soldiers fought with a desperate intensity, fueled by the knowledge that there was no retreat. In one district, a group of Hungarian Honvéd troops held an apartment block for 3 days against repeated Soviet assaults using only a single machine gun and Molotov cocktails crafted in shattered kitchens. Their resistance, though ultimately futile, slowed the Soviet advance long enough for civilians to flee into deeper shelters beneath Buda. Artillery duels intensified along the riverbanks, where Soviet guns pounded surviving German positions into rubble. The roar of tank engines echoed through Pest's boulevards as Soviet T-34s maneuvered between ruins, firing shells that detonated with thunderous force, sending shockwaves through the city's foundations. German panzer units attempted to counter these advances, but fuel shortages left most of their vehicles immobilized or abandoned. In desperate moments, German crews converted damaged tanks into static gun emplacements, firing until the barrels overheated or the positions were overrun. Soviet forces responded with overwhelming firepower, employing sappers to breach fortifications and stormtroopers to clear strongpoints. The battle took on a rhythm of destruction that left defenders numb to the devastation around them. Yet amid the violence, moments of haunting stillness emerged. Silent courtyards dusted with snow, alleyways littered with spent casings, frozen bodies lying untouched where they had fallen. These eerie interludes offered no comfort, only reminders of the human cost etched into every street. Civilians trapped within the city experienced the climax with a terror that defied description. Many had taken refuge in the extensive network of cellars beneath Budapest, where they lived in perpetual twilight illuminated by flickering candles and oil lamps. The air grew thick with smoke and fear as more families crowded into shrinking spaces. Explosions overhead sent dust cascading from from the ceilings, and each blast felt closer than the last. Children cried through the nights, their sobs muffled by mothers who feared drawing attention from roaming soldiers or arrow cross patrols. Food scarcity reached catastrophic levels. Families boiled wallpaper for the starch, scraped mold from bread, and bartered heirlooms for handfuls of beans. Diseases, typhus, dysentery, influenza, spread rapidly through overcrowded shelters. Despite the danger, some civilians braved the streets in search of supplies, dodging sniper fire and collapsing walls. One woman recalled carrying a bucket of river water up 3 flights of stairs, only to watch it spill across the floor when a nearby blast shattered the windows. The war, she wrote later, was not outside anymore. It lived in our bones. On the Soviet side, the climax of the siege demanded relentless commitment. Soviet commanders ordered fresh assaults into key districts, determined to break the remaining Axis resistance before a rumored German relief attempt could approach from the west. Reinforcements arrived across the icy plains surrounding the city, their boots crunching through snow as they advanced into the inferno. Soviet infantry pushed deeper into Pest, while elite units crossed the frozen Danube under cover of darkness, establishing precarious bridgeheads that expanded with each passing hour. The fighting grew more vicious as defenders realized that losing the riverfront meant losing the last barrier between Pest and Buda. In bitter firefights among the palace walls and narrow medieval streets of Buda, soldiers fought at arm's reach, their breath freezing in the air as they grappled in stairwells and courtyards dusted with snow and blood. Both sides understood that the battle had reached a turning point. Budapest was no longer a city under attack, but a city in collapse. All of these forces converged in a crescendo of violence and desperation, bringing Budapest to the brink of total destruction. And as the final defensive lines began to unravel, and the possibility of relief faded into myth, the battle surged toward its decisive and catastrophic conclusion. As January 1945 ground toward its final days, the defenders of Budapest found themselves pushed into a shrinking crescent of territory in western Buda, pressed against the rising slopes of Castle Hill and the labyrinth of medieval streets that wound beneath the royal palace. The once grand district, a symbol of Hungarian history and culture, now lay buried beneath layers of rubble, smoke, and broken stone. Each day began with the thunder of Soviet artillery slamming into the hillside, shaking the foundations of fortifications that had survived centuries but now crumbled under modern firepower. The royal palace, perched above the Danube like a crown, became the epicenter of a storm of steel and flame. Soviet storm groups advanced relentlessly, using captured cellars, breached walls, and collapsed tunnels to infiltrate deeper into the remaining Axis positions. German and Hungarian defenders fought room to room, their weapons fouled with dust and their eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. The palace floors, once polished and echoing with state ceremonies, were now stained with blood and scattered with debris from shattered chandeliers, broken rifles, and fallen soldiers who had nowhere left to retreat. The final days were defined by the collapse of order. Communication lines snapped, leaving units isolated and uncertain whether anyone still commanded the defense. Officers attempted to rally their men with promises of relief, pointing westward toward the faint hope of the German Conrad offensives attempting to break through the encirclement, but each day brought news more devastating than the last. Operation Conrad had failed, Conrad VI had been repelled, and now Conrad III, the final attempt to reach Budapest, was faltering under heavy Soviet counterattacks. The defenders understood what this meant. No help was coming. Even the most hardened veterans felt the weight of that realization. Reports from the Palace district described men staring blankly into the distance after receiving the news, their resolve sagging under the crushing truth that they had been left to die inside the burning city. Yet, despite this understanding, many continued to fight, not out of loyalty to Hitler or Sully, but because surrender seemed no more survivable than resistance. As Soviet forces pressed further into Buda, the nature of combat devolved into brutality seldom recorded on the Western Front. Fighting erupted along castle walls slick with ice, in narrow staircases where bodies piled upon bodies, and in snow-covered courtyards where men grappled at arm's length. Soviet sappers blasted breaches through ancient stone walls, sending shock waves through tunnels where wounded soldiers lay in makeshift infirmaries. The wounded begged for water, morphine, or simply the comfort of a familiar voice. But medics were overwhelmed and supplies nearly non-existent. Some soldiers, trapped beneath collapsed beams or pinned in shattered rooms, froze to death before rescue could reach them. Others, seeking to escape the inferno, attempted to cross the open ground of the Vermizu field only to be cut down by machine gun fire. The once proud city had become a maze of death, and every path toward survival narrowed with each passing hour. Civilians were caught in the same tightening vice. As Soviet forces advanced, thousands fled deeper into the cave systems beneath Castle Hill, joining families who had already been living underground for weeks. The caverns, normally used for wine storage or wartime shelters, became overcrowded sanctuaries filled with the sick, the injured, and the terrified. The air grew foul with the smell of smoke, sweat, and the stagnant breath of hundreds huddled together. Children cried in the dim glow of candles. Mothers whispered prayers for deliverance, and elders clutched keepsakes from homes they knew they would never see again. When Soviet shells struck above, dust rained from the ceilings, and the rumble of collapsing masonry echoed through the tunnels like distant thunder. These civilians were not combatants, yet they endured the same fear and suffering as the soldiers outside. Some emerged briefly to search for water or food, only to witness scenes of devastation so overwhelming that they retreated underground again in sobbing silence. Their presence in the caves became a living testament to the depth of Budapest's agony. By early February, Axis resistance had been compressed into a few blocks around the Palace district. The defenders mounted a final breakout attempt on February 11th, a desperate midnight charge through the narrow streets of Buda in freezing cold. Small groups of German and Hungarian soldiers slipped through the ruins, trying to navigate past Soviet encirclement toward the hills west of the city. But Soviet forces, having anticipated such an attempt, unleashed a devastating counter-assault. Flares lit up the night sky, revealing silhouettes of fleeing soldiers who were then cut down by machine guns, artillery, and rifle fire. The snow turned red as hundreds fell within minutes. Only a handful managed to escape the city, most dying in the forests or villages beyond Buda. This failed breakout marked the final collapse of organized resistance. In the days that followed, Soviet troops seized the remaining strongpoints, raising their flags over the battered remnants of the royal palace. Budapest had fallen. The city lay silent beneath a blanket of smoke and ash, its defenders dead, captured, or scattered. With the last echoes of battle fading from the hills above the Danube, Budapest transitioned from a fortress under siege to a city mourning its ruin, setting the stage for a reckoning that would unfold with devastating clarity in the aftermath. When the last shots faded across the frozen hills of Buda in mid-February 1945, Budapest lay in a state that defied comprehension. What had once been one of Europe's most elegant capitals, a city of theaters, cafes, grand boulevards, and shimmering river bridges, had been reduced to a carcass of scorched stone and ash. Entire districts were flattened into featureless plains of rubble. Streets were blocked by collapsed facades, burned-out trams, and bodies half buried beneath snow and debris. The Danube ran thick with the remnants of war, shattered beams, broken barges, fragments of bridges, and unclaimed dead carried downstream by the icy current. Even the silence that followed the battle carried its own weight, broken only by the occasional echo of distant artillery or the creak of ruined structures sagging under their own destruction. Soviet troops moving through the city's ruins reported scenes reminiscent of Stalingrad. Families emerging from basements like ghosts, soldiers too weak to stand, and neighborhoods marked by a stench of death that winter frost could not mask. The human cost of the siege was staggering. Estimates suggest that 38,000 civilians were killed, though some historians believe the true number was far higher due to incomplete records and thousands who disappeared in the chaos. Hunger had hollowed out entire communities. Children were found in shelters with limbs swollen from starvation, elders frozen in doorways while searching for firewood, and families who had survived the fighting only to succumb to disease. Typhus swept through the overcrowded cellars and improvised hospitals, claiming victims who had already endured weeks of deprivation. In the aftermath, doctors described the city as a mosaic of human tragedy. Streets lined with corpses wrapped in blankets, makeshift graves dug into courtyards, and survivors wandering aimlessly in shock. Military losses were equally catastrophic. Approximately 80,000 Axis soldiers, German and Hungarian, were killed or captured, including nearly the entire ISS Mountain Corps and most of the Hungarian units defending Buda. The failed breakout attempt alone accounted for thousands of dead, their bodies still lying in snow-covered parks and gardens when Soviet units advanced in the following days. The collapse of Budapest's defenders shattered what little remained of Hungary's ability to conduct organized resistance. German hopes of stabilizing the front evaporated, and Hungarian officers who survived the siege faced the grim reality that their country had been sacrificed in a battle whose outcome was sealed long before the first Soviet shell landed. For many Hungarian soldiers, the fall of Budapest was not merely a military defeat, but the symbolic end of a nation's autonomy. A moment when the dream of preserving Hungarian control over its own fate died under the weight of foreign armies. Soviet forces emerged victorious but battered. Their casualties were immense. Some estimates place Soviet losses at over 100,000 killed or wounded during the siege. Yet the Red Army's leadership viewed the capture of Budapest as an essential victory. It opened the strategic route to Vienna, solidified Soviet influence over post-war Hungary, and demonstrated to the Allies that Stalin's armies were capable of sweeping through Central Europe with overwhelming momentum. Soviet war correspondents described their triumph in terms of liberation, though soldiers on the ground often saw only ruin, suffering, and the bitter consequences of urban warfare. For many, the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the cost paid in blood and the devastation left behind. But the aftermath also revealed deeper fractures within Hungarian society. The Arrow-Cross regime collapsed almost immediately, its leaders fleeing or being captured by Soviet forces. Civilians who had endured months of terror under the Arrow-Cross sought justice, turning in perpetrators or recounting atrocities committed along the riverbanks where thousands of Jews had been murdered. Budapest became not only a city rebuilding from physical destruction, but also a city confronting political, moral, and social wounds that would shape the nation's future. Survivors faced a harsh new reality: Soviet occupation, the dismantling of old institutions, and the uncertainty of what Hungary would become under the shifting post-war landscape. Amid the ruins, a question lingered like smoke over the river. How would a broken city, stripped of hope and haunted by what it had endured, rebuild its soul? The answer to that question would unfold slowly and painfully in the years that followed, forming the deeper currents explored in the next section. In the months following the fall of Budapest, the city struggled to rise from the devastation that had consumed it, confronting not only the physical ruins of war, but the profound transformation of its political and social landscape. Soviet occupation reshaped daily life with abrupt force. Red Army administrators took control of key institutions, and the remnants of the Arrow-Cross regime were hunted down in courtrooms or seized by enraged civilians seeking retribution. Former party officials were brought before tribunals where testimonies of cruelty, mass executions, and the terror inflicted on the Jewish population filled the records of a city desperate to restore moral balance. Survivors emerged from ghettos, safe houses, and hiding places to find a capital stripped bare, its synagogues damaged, its communities scattered, and its heart forever altered. Yet, amid destruction, there was an undeniable will to rebuild. Jewish relief organizations, international aid groups, and local volunteers began clearing rubble, reopening hospitals, and distributing food in neighborhoods still echoing with memories of gunfire. These efforts offered glimmers of hope, even as hunger and disease continued to claim victims in a city whose infrastructure lay in ruins. Politically, Hungary entered a period of upheaval that dismantled the old world and ushered in a new one dictated by Soviet influence. The provisional government established in Debrecen soon moved to Budapest, where its authority expanded under the watchful eye of Moscow. Land reforms redistributed estates that had defined Hungary's aristocratic hierarchy for centuries, while arrests of former military and political elites signaled the end of the pre-war order. For many Hungarians, these changes represented both liberation and loss. Freedom from fascism intertwined with the emergence of a system increasingly shaped by communist ideology. The Hungarian Communist Party, though initially small, gained rapid momentum as Soviet authorities ensured its dominance in the political arena. Newspapers aligned with the new regime promoted narratives of reconstruction and social justice. Yet beneath these slogans lay a growing sense that Hungary's future was no longer in Hungarian hands. The war had taken lives, homes, and hope. Now it took sovereignty as well. Economically, the city faced a monumental struggle. Factories lay dormant beneath collapsed roofs, public utilities suffered catastrophic damage, and transportation networks were crippled. Trams and buses lay twisted in streets still littered with debris. Bridges across the Danube, vital arteries of the city, had to be rebuilt from their foundations, requiring labor, materials, and engineering resources that were scarce in the first chaotic months after liberation. Inflation spiraled as food and fuel remained limited, turning the once mighty Hungarian pengu into a currency so devalued it became nearly meaningless. Barter became a common means of survival. Families traded clothing, tools, and heirlooms for bread or firewood. Yet slowly, through determination and necessity, the first signs of renewal appeared. Shops reopened on ruined streets, streetcars returned with patched roofs and repaired rails, and community centers organized rebuilding brigades that cleared rubble one brick at a time. Budapesters, hardened by suffering, carried an unspoken understanding that if the city were to rise, it would do so through their own hands. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred within the collective memory of the nation. The siege of Budapest became a wound etched into Hungary's identity, a symbol of both resilience and tragedy. The stories of those who died in the streets, those who survived underground, and those who fought in hopeless resistance formed a tapestry of remembrance that future generations would inherit. Families rebuilt homes atop foundations still marked by shellfire. Yet they preserved fragments of the old walls as a reminder of what had been endured. The Danube, which had carried away the wreckage of war, now carried the weight of memory, flowing through a city that had been irrevocably changed. Historians, poets, and veterans attempted to capture the enormity of what had happened, but no single narrative could encompass the suffering, courage, and loss that defined those weeks. Budapest's survival was not a triumph in the traditional sense. It was an affirmation of endurance, a testament to the human ability to rebuild even when hope seems lost. And as the city slowly awakened from the nightmare of siege, it carried forward a solemn truth: that the fires which once consumed Budapest had also forged a resilience that would shape its future long after the smoke had faded.